Alfred O'Reilly, a link between the 1922 and 1937 constitutions. The Constitution Committee appointed to draft the 1922 Constitution produced 3 alternative drafts for consideration by the Irish Provisional Government. Drafts A and B were very similar except for the articles on the composition of the executive. Draft B was finally chosen as the basis for the future constitution of the Irish Free State. The third draft, known as Draft C, was very different from the other two. It was drafted by Alfred O'Reilly, professor of mathematical physics at University College Cork, and won the support of James Murnaghan, professor of jurisprudence, Roman law and international law at University College Dublin, the other academic on the 1922 Constitution Committee. O'Reilly, a polymath of inexhaustible energy, has been described by biographers as a controversialist, pugnacious polemicist, flamboyant, extrovert, disputatious and dynamic. Poor health and a number of personality clashes with other members of the Constitution Committee ensured that he was absent from many of the drafting meetings. This isolation permitted the production of a draft constitution that was very different from drafts A and B. O'Reilly distanced himself from most members of the Constitution Committee in order that he be free to draft a document imbued with his own ideas on the place of religion, natural law and the family in Irish society. Chapter 8 of Draft C dealt with family, education, religion, which O'Reilly and others considered the most distinctive aspect of his draft constitution. The final version of Draft C provided as follows. Article 53. 1. Marriage, as the basis of family life and national well-being, is under the special protection of the state, and all attacks on purity, health and sacredness of family life shall be forbidden. 2. The Irish state shall recognize, as heretofore, the inviolable sanctity of the marital bond. 3. The civil validity of religiously solemnized marriages shall be recognized, provided that the details of registration prescribed by legislation are duly complied with. Article 54. 1. Parents have the right and duty of rearing and educating their children, so as to make them good citizens. The state has the right of supervision. Parents must provide their children with education at least up to the completed 14th year of age. This obligation shall be determined in detail by law. 2. Children deprived of parental care have the right to the help and protection of the state in the limits fixed by law. A judicial decree is necessary to deprive parents of their right over the child. Article 55. 1. Maternity shall be under the special protection of the law. 2. Young people shall be protected against exploitation and against moral, intellectual, or bodily neglect. 3. The employment of children under 14 in wage-earning occupations, work of adolescents in injurious trades, and industrial night work of women shall be forbidden by law. O'Reilly believed that the necessity for including such matters in a constitution was obvious and required no elaborate explanation or defense. Nevertheless, he did provide a brief justification for their inclusion in an article intended for publication in the Jesuit journal Studies in 1922. The provisional government forbade publication of this article as part of an overall policy at ensuring the secrecy of all the drafting materials produced by the Constitution Committee. O'Reilly was convinced that his provisions on the family represented the views of the vast majority of the people of Ireland. He concluded, "Any government in this country, which fancies that it can ignore all this in our Constitution, is under some peculiar delusion." O'Reilly's arguments were rejected and his Draft C was never seriously considered as a possible basis for the Free State Constitution by the Provisional Government. O'Reilly later complained that the draft was unanimously rejected without even a personal discussion with me such as they had with the other signatories of the other draft. O'Reilly's combative personality and his absence from many of the meetings of the Constitution Committee had done nothing to endear him to most of his colleagues or with members of the Provisional Government. There were a number of additional reasons why O'Reilly's Draft C was not given greater consideration. The most important of these was that O'Reilly had very different ideas concerning the purpose of a national constitution to the Provisional Government and the many members of the Constitution Committee. O'Reilly wished to produce a constitution that would educate and stimulate the people. This ensured that it was vital to include expressions of guiding ideals to direct and inspire future legislation. By contrast, the Provisional Government wanted a short and simple constitution that focused on the mechanics of government that could face the challenges of an uncertain future. O'Reilly's disappointment ensured that he proved one of the most persistent critics of 1922 Constitution in the years that followed. At the heart of his impression that the 1922 Constitution was a false start was the position that neither parent nor family is so much as mentioned in our present Constitution. O'Reilly concluded that in terms of enumerating fundamental principles, the present Constitution is a lamentable failure. In place of a recital of fundamental principles, natural rights and social ideals the state had been given, a woefully meager, barren and inaccurate constitution, which is out of touch with the living ideals of our people. For O'Reilly, these ideals certainly included the family as the oldest and most basic social institution. He maintained, it is ridiculous to argue that the present Constitution protects the family, which it does not mention. O'Reilly went further when he insisted, at the present moment we really have no constitution at all. On fundamental questions like family, marriage, education, private property, social structure, we have failed to enunciate a single clear principle. His solution was to ditch the 1922 text and produce a new constitution, based on Catholic principles of natural right and social justice. What was needed was a constitution safeguarding natural rights and moral principles, enunciating social ideals, in consonance with the professed tenets of our people. In the 1930s, an entirely new constitution was produced that attempted to fulfill these goals. O'Reilly's assistance was soon required by the new Fianna Fáil government that came to power in 1932. He provided advice on the legal means of removing the controversial parliamentary oath imposed by the 1921 treaty. The oath was duly removed from the substantive articles of the Constitution in 1933. This proved to be an important first step in a process of removing the influence of the 1921 treaty from the text of the 1922 Constitution. The entirely new Constitution of 1937 was intended as the final step in achieving this goal. O'Reilly sent the text of Draft C along with other materials to the Irish government during the drafting process. Although there is no evidence that O'Reilly had anything more than an indirect role in the drafting of the 1937 Constitution, his influence remained significant. For example, Article 55 of O'Reilly's Draft C declared that maternity shall be under the special protection of the law, and further provided that industrial night work of women shall be forbidden by law. These provisions reflect a similar spirit to that contained in Articles 41, 2 and 45, 4 of de Valera's Constitution. Another provision of Draft C that is echoed in the 1937 Constitution is the declaration that marriage, as the basis of family life and national well-being, is under the special protection of the state, and all attacks on the purity, health and sacredness of family life shall be forbidden. Quote, the draft produced by O'Reilly also committed the state to recognizing the inviolable sanctity of the marital bond, which was mirrored in the original version of Article 41. 3. 2 degrees of the 1937 Constitution. O'Reilly's own reaction to the 1937 Constitution was broadly supportive. The family and motherhood Article 41 is in many ways excellent, and at last removes a glaring defect of the present Constitution which calmly ignores the family. However, O'Reilly was quite clear that the provisions on the family in the draft 1937 Constitution could be improved. For example, he was disappointed that de Valera had declined to include the family vote, guaranteeing extra votes for married people. Although he approved of the principle contained provision in Article 41. 2 degrees that the state shall endeavor to ensure that mothers shall not be obliged by economic necessity to engage in labor to the neglect of duties in the home. He felt that the word endeavor created imprecision and, in any case, felt that such provisions were unnecessary in a national constitution and best left to legislation. The greatest similarity between O'Reilly's Draft C and the 1937 Constitution was their attitudes to the purpose of a national constitution, which was utterly different to that of the provisional government in 1922. De Valera revealed his approach to drafting a constitution in a radio address made on the 30th of April 1937. He emphasized that the new constitution was designed to provide a firm foundation for an ordered life and peaceful political development within the community, but added, the ideals which ought to inspire and direct that development are rightly emphasized. He continued, I know that there are many theorists who take the view that a written constitution should contain nothing more than the legal machinery necessary for the establishment and control of the organs of state. Whilst agreeing that a constitution should be as simple as possible, I cannot altogether share that view. In my judgment, a constitution ought to do more than define the character of the legislative, executive and judicial regime, and if it be based on the democratic principle it ought to do more, for example, than prescribe how the representative institutions should function, how the parliamentary responsibility of the executive is to be secured, the independence of the judiciary maintained, or the principle of universal suffrage applied. It should inspire as well as control, elicit loyalty as well as compel it. Quote, This approach to drafting a constitution was similar to that adopted by O'Reilly in 1922. O'Reilly may not have been in entire agreement with all of de Valera's provisions in relation to safeguarding and buttressing the position of the family in Irish society, but he insisted that the differences were largely matters of wording and detail. O'Reilly concluded that de Valera should be sincerely congratulated on his courageous exposition of Catholic social principles. The largest opposition party, Fine Gael, did not attack the contents of the constitutional provisions on the family so much as the approach to drafting a constitution that they represented. John A. Costello made this clear when he told the Dáil, "You cannot, by merely inserting a principle which everybody agrees with and putting it down on paper, pretend that you have carried out in practice some laudable purpose which we all would wish to see achieved. Merely writing down high principles in this constitution is not going to see that these things are, in fact, achieved in practice. There is a lot of theory in this constitution." Quote, the independent T.D. Robert Rowlett told the Dáil in 1937 that a constitution is essentially a legal document and should be declaratory of the structure of the state and the rights of individual citizens. He complained that instead of taking this approach, the proposed 1937 constitution consists largely of a moral homily in which various directions are given as to the lines on which the state should work in the future. The opposition in the Dáil, which tended to stereotype the 1937 Constitution as the work of de Valera alone, labeled the aim of educating the Irish people as part of a wider agenda of political control. John A. Costello condemned this with unrestrained sarcasm. Public opinion must be educated until it coincides with the whim, will and pleasure, the peculiar views and the constitutional pirouetting of the particular president. Nevertheless, de Valera made no apology and revealed his vision of a constitution when he told the Dáil, "It is not being narrowed down to a mere framework, merely giving you the institutions of the state. That is the view that some people hold of what it should be. This is intended to do more. It is intended to offer directions in which the state, as a whole, should move." Quote, conclusion. The 1922 Constitution is often praised for its secular nature. Despite drafting errors arising from inexperience, the simplicity of its text and its minimal inclusion of directive principles has ensured that the 1922 Constitution has aged relatively well. It has been described as a typical liberal democratic document which would have suited a country of any religious complexion. By contrast, the directive principles of the 1937 Constitution, including the provisions on the family, women and marriage, have aged badly and damaged its reputation. Although the provisions recognizing the special position of the Catholic Church and the ban on divorce have since been removed, many directive principles remain in the 1937 Constitution that continue to cause offense and damage its popular image. The case law that has followed the enshrinement of the provisions on the family into the 1937 Constitution has increased rather than decreased their controversial nature. Examples include decisions that the provisions on the family only protects families based on the institution of marriage, the striking down of legal measures intended to ensure equal ownership of a marital home, decisions that prioritize the rights of parents over the best interests of the child, the upholding of laws that discriminated against men, the upholding of discrimination against illegitimate children, justification for denying the decriminalization of homosexuality in 1984, and the original determination that the right to marry was confined to couples of the opposite sex that required the 34th Amendment in 2015. The provisions on the position of women in the home have been described as probably the most contentious provisions in the Constitution, but have been interpreted by the courts in a manner that provides little, if any, benefit to women working in the home. Of course, it can be argued that Article 41 has inspired positive decisions too. For example, it is argued that Article 41 has curbed some of the excesses of state intervention in family life experienced in other jurisdictions. However, this does not alter the reality that directive principles such as those found in Article 41, which recognizes that family has special status in Irish society but provides little guidance as to the legal consequences of this declaration, gives unelected judges interpretive guidance that may influence the evolution of Irish law in directions that may not always enjoy popular support. Would the inclusion of significant amendments or the drafting of an entirely new Irish constitution in the early 21st century ameliorate these difficulties? There is some evidence to support the suggestion that the spirit of constitution drafting in early 21st century Ireland is actually closer to that of 1937 than that of 1922. Of course, there is greater support for secularism and different conceptions of the meaning of family in the early 21st century than existed a century earlier. Nevertheless, the reports of bodies appointed to advise on the revision of the Constitution indicate the existence of support for enshrining a substantial number of new directive principles into the text. For example, a substantial portion of the Constitution Review Group convened in the 1990s supported enshrining provisions in the Constitution supporting affirmative action policies. Other examples can be found in the proposal to include provisions on economic, social and cultural rights in the text of the Constitution that won the support of 85% to the Constitution Convention that reported in 2014. Members of the convention voted that certain rights should be expressly stated in the Constitution, including the rights to housing, social security and essential health care. The nature of these proposed rights would, of course, be entirely dependent on their final wording. They could be placed in the Constitution as directive principles in a similar form the existing provisions of Article 45. The alternative would be to overturn the existing structure of the doctrine of separation of powers by giving the courts substantial powers over the allocation of finite resources that have traditionally belonged to executives and legislatures that are responsible to the electorate. Neither course is guaranteed to enjoy popular support in a possible future in which increasing populations may be dependent on fewer resources than are currently available. The 1922 Constitution was deliberately drafted to be as short and simple a document as possible with an absolute minimum of directive principles. Although constitutions drafted along these lines might be accused of being plain and austere, they also date better and tend to survive longer than constitutions that try to freeze the values of a particular point of time in their pages. Examples of constitutions that have largely avoided these pitfalls include the 1789 Constitution of the United States of America, the 1867 Constitution of Canada and the 1901 Constitution of Australia. This approach does not require abandonment of important provisions on human rights, although it may result in their being enshrined in separate instruments to the rest of the Constitution that might have a different procedure for amendment to that of the main text. It is true that directive principles are often the most interesting provisions of any national constitution, and to cut them down to an absolute minimum might be seen as creating an insipid constitution that would fail to inspire its citizens. Yet directive principles can repel citizens and discredit a constitution just as easily as they can inspire citizens and elevate the reputation of its provisions. In no part of the 1937 Constitution is this reality more apparent than in the provisions concerning the family, marriage, and the position of women. The greatest difference between the drafters of the 1922 and 1937 constitutions concern their attitudes towards the future. The drafters of the 1922 Constitution drafted their document at a time of uncertainty and when the limbs of the infant state were still supple. The future development of the new state could not easily be predicted, and most of the drafters were well aware of this reality. By contrast, de Valera openly admitted that the 1937 Constitution enshrined provisions intended to create a Christian polity. These provisions were intended to point out directions in which the state, as a whole, should move in the future. Patrick Hogan, a Labour TD, reminded the Dale in 1937 that values change with the passage of time. He warned, "I think it is very bad to put so much into the present constitution, to make a rigid constitution now when so much of the ideals and hopes and aspirations of our people are in flux." The reality that social values change with the passage of time is most apparent in the provisions of the 1937 Constitution concerning the family, marriage and women. Indeed, Article 41 had long-term consequences that would have alarmed and run contrary to the values of those who drafted it or inspired its drafting. The most obvious example of this is the case of McGee v. Attorney General, in which legislative provisions preventing a married couple from making use of contraceptives were found to be inconsistent with rights of marital privacy. It may be recalled that the drafters of the 1937 Constitution had originally considered an express provision outlawing the use or importation of contraceptive products. It can be argued that the 1937 Constitution was not exceptional in the interwar world in enshrining a significant number of directive principles in its text, including those related to the family, religion, marriage and the position of women in society. Yet this argument ignores the position that there were also many constitutions in existence in the 1920s and 1930s, as indicated above, that did not follow this course. Both approaches had their advocates and many working examples in foreign constitutions in 1922 and in 1937. In 1922, the drafters consciously chose to create a short and functional constitution that kept directive principles to an absolute minimum. In 1937, the drafters consciously chose to differentiate their constitution from its predecessor by enshrining a substantial amount of directive principles that reflected the values held by many, though not all, Irish citizens at that date. Many of these provisions, in particular those connected with the family, have dated badly and have damaged the reputation of the 1937 Constitution in the eyes of many living in the early 21st century. Yet the reports of expert groups continue to advocate replacing dated directive principles with others that might appear equally dated in an uncertain future. The idea that a national constitution should be built around a substantial number of directive principles is based on the fundamental assumption that these are desirable and even essential subjects for inclusion in the substantive provisions. This assumption is, perhaps, among the greatest legacies of the Constitution drafted in 1937.